Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. If you feel fear, you should like and subscribe this channel. So, let's go. The story of La Llorona, the Weeping Woman, is one of the most famous and chilling legends in Mexican folklore. Growing up in a small town in rural Mexico, I had heard the stories countless times from my grandmother. She warned us about La Llorona, how she would come for children who wandered too far from home after dark. I never truly believed it, thinking it was just an old tale meant to keep us in line. But one night I experienced something that made me question everything I thought I knew. It was a warm evening in late autumn when I was about 12. My cousins and I were playing near the river that ran through the outskirts of town. We had been warned never to go near it after sunset, but we were adventurous and fearless back then. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink. We should have gone home, but we stayed, captivated by the beauty of the evening. As the darkness crept in, a cold breeze swept through the trees, making the leaves rustle ominously. That's when we heard it. Soft, sorrowful wailing carried on the wind. It started faint, but it grew louder with each passing second. At first, we thought it was an animal, but as the sound became clearer, it was unmistakable. A woman was crying. No, screaming, her voice full of despair and anguish. "Do you hear that?" my cousin whispered, his face pale. I nodded, but I couldn't find the words to respond. The sound was chilling, like the voice of someone lost, a mother in pain. We gathered ourselves and turned to head home, but then we heard it again, much closer this time. The scream was followed by a long, mournful cry. "Ay, mis hijos, mis hijos. Oh, my children, my children." The voice seemed to be coming from the riverbank itself. We froze, fear sinking deep into our bones. That was when we saw her. A figure stood at the water's edge, shrouded in white. Her long, disheveled hair hung around her face, obscuring her features, but her eyes were the worst part. Black, hollow, like endless pits of darkness. Her clothes were ragged, soaked, as though she had just risen from the river itself. She wailed again, louder this time, and the sound sent a chill that ran from my spine to my fingertips. We couldn't move. The stories my grandmother had told me about La Llorona suddenly felt too real. The woman's face twisted in pain as she reached out toward us, her hands trembling. "Help me," she moaned, her voice barely above a whisper. "Help me find them." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't listen. The air around us felt suffocating, heavy with an unseen presence. My cousin tried to pull me away, but it was like the earth itself was holding us there. Suddenly, the woman lurched forward, her arms stretching toward us with an unnatural speed. The sound of rushing water filled the air as the river seemed to swell and churn around her feet. "Ayúdame," she sobbed again, her voice raw with desperation. "Ayúdame a encontrar mis hijos." Help me find my children. Without thinking, I broke free from the spell that had held me. I grabbed my cousin's arm and we ran. Ran faster than I ever had in my life, not stopping until we reached the safety of our home. My heart pounded in my chest and the screams of La Llorona echoed in my ears long after we had locked the door behind us. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the woman, standing at the edge of the river with her outstretched arms, haunted me. I knew then that La Llorona was not just a story. She was real, the ghost of a mother doomed to wander the earth for eternity, searching for her lost children. Over the years, I would hear the legend again and again from others in the town, people who had experienced similar encounters with La Llorona. Some had heard her cries from the riverbanks. Others had seen her figure standing in the shadows of their homes. But I never forgot that night. The weeping woman had found me. and for a moment I felt her pain as if it were my own. They say La Llorona still roams the riverbanks of Mexico, searching, crying for the children she lost. And if you listen closely on a quiet night, you might hear her wailing in the wind, forever lost in her sorrow. I grew up in a small town in Mexico, nestled between the mountains and the river. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where the sound of church bells in the evening would echo through the streets, and the air was always heavy with the smell of earth and growing things. But along with the peace of this quiet town, there was a shadow, one that had haunted us for generations. It's a story I've heard all my life, and one that I know many others have experienced. It's the tale of La Llorona, the weeping woman, a spirit who roams the banks of rivers and lakes, crying out for her lost children. Some say she drowned them in a fit of rage, others that they were taken from her by the river itself. But no matter which version of the story you hear, one thing is always the same. She wanders at night, her cries echoing through the darkness, her mournful wail carried by the wind. My own experience with La Llorona happened one night when I was a child, during a trip to visit my grandmother's house in the countryside. We lived in the city, so I was used to noise, cars, voices, the hum of life, but at my grandmother's house it was different. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that can feel unnerving at times. I remember my grandmother warning me to stay inside. After sunset, "Don't go near the river at night," she would say. "La Llorona comes out when the moon is full. You don't want to meet her." I didn't think much of it, of course. Kids don't believe in ghosts. But one night, my cousins and I decided to sneak out and explore the river. It was a full moon, the light casting everything in a soft silver glow. We thought it would be an adventure, something exciting to talk about later. We grabbed flashlights and made our way down the familiar path toward the riverbank, laughing and talking, not thinking about anything except the fun of sneaking away from the house. As we approached the water, I felt a strange shift in the air. The temperature seemed to drop, and the peaceful sounds of nature, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, suddenly stopped. I froze, looking around, but my cousins didn't seem to notice. They were too busy teasing each other and throwing rocks into the water. But then I heard it. A soft, distant cry. At first, I thought it was an animal, but there was something different about it. The cry echoed, rising and falling like a wail, filled with so much sorrow that it made my chest tighten. I felt a chill creep up my spine. "Did you hear that?" I asked my cousin, grabbing his arm, but he didn't answer. He just kept walking toward the water, oblivious. The cry came again, closer this time, and I felt my heart race. "We need to go," I whispered urgently, but my cousins laughed it off, thinking I was just being scared. Then we saw her. At the edge of the river, there was a figure, a woman dressed in white. Her long, wet hair hung over her face and her hands were stretched out as though reaching for something. I couldn't see her face, but the air around her was thick with an overwhelming sense of sadness. Her cry was louder now, clearer. It was unmistakable. She was calling for her children. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure didn't seem to notice us at first, but as I turned to leave, her head snapped up, and I saw her face, twisted in anguish, her eyes dark and hollow, as if they were endless pits of sorrow. Without thinking, I grabbed my cousins and pulled them toward the path, yelling at them to run. The woman's cry followed us, growing louder and more desperate with every step we took. It wasn't until we were safely back at the house that the cries stopped. We never spoke of what we saw that night, not to anyone. But from that moment on, I could never forget the sound of La Llorona's wail. And to this day, I can't walk near any river or lake at night without feeling the cold, eerie sensation of someone watching me from the darkness. I don't know if what we saw that night was La Llorona, or if it was just a figment of our imagination. But I've never been able to shake the feeling that there are things in this world that can't be explained, things that linger long after we stop believing in them. There's an old hospital in Mexico, one that locals whisper about but never name aloud. It has been abandoned for years, its halls empty, its rooms left to decay. But the people who worked there, especially the night staff, tell a different story. My uncle, a paramedic, once had to transport a patient there late at night. This was before the hospital closed, but even then, it had a reputation. The staff spoke of shadows moving on their own, of whispers in empty rooms, of patients ringing for nurses long after they had passed away. My uncle never believed in ghosts, but that night changed him. The emergency room was nearly deserted when he arrived. He and his partner wheeled the patient in, the fluorescent lights flickering above them. The place felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. Even hospitals had a certain hum of life, but this one felt abandoned. As they moved through the dim corridors, my uncle felt it first, the sensation of being watched. He turned, expecting to see a doctor or a nurse, but the hallway was empty. Then, the lights cut out. The hallway plunged into darkness and an unnatural cold filled the air. His breath came out in a mist. His partner cursed, fumbling for a flashlight. Before they could turn it on, the emergency lights flickered back to life, and that's when they saw her. At the end of the corridor stood a woman in a hospital gown, her long black hair hanging over her face. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there motionless. Thinking she was a lost patient, my uncle called out to her. No response. He stepped forward, his instincts as a paramedic kicking in. But as he did, the woman's head snapped up. Her face was wrong, hollow. Her eyes were empty sockets, dark pits that seemed to stretch into nothingness. Her mouth twisted open, but no sound came out. Just a horrible silence that filled the space between them. Then she moved, not like a person walking, but like something being pulled. One moment she was at the end of the hallway. The next, she was closer. Then closer. My uncle didn't wait. He grabbed his partner and ran, pushing the stretcher forward as fast as he could. Behind them, the sound of dragging feet echoed through the halls. When they finally reached the main desk, the night nurse was there, completely unfazed. My uncle, panting, tried to explain what they had seen. The nurse didn't react. She just sighed, rubbing her temples. "You saw her, didn't you?" she said. That was the night my uncle learned the truth. The hospital had closed certain wings after a tragic accident years ago. A fire had broken out in one of the rooms, killing several patients, including a woman whose body was never recovered. Some say she still wanders the halls looking for help. Others say she's not looking for help at all. The hospital is abandoned now, left to rot. But those who pass by at night swear they still see a flickering light inside, hear the beeping of machines that no longer work. And sometimes, just for a moment, they see a figure standing in the window, watching, waiting. I had heard the stories my whole life of the old forest at the edge of the village, the one no one ventured into after sunset. As a child, I thought it was just an exaggeration, the kind of tale adults tell to keep kids from wandering off. But years later, I found myself standing at the edge of that very forest on a dare from some friends. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of red and purple. We stood at the forest's edge, the trees dense and twisted, their branches stretching out like skeletal hands. My friends had all warned me not to go in, but I was determined to prove them wrong. I took a deep breath, stepping into the cool shadows of the forest. The air felt thick, almost heavy, as if something was watching me. The trees loomed over me, their bark gnarled and dark. With every step, I felt like the forest was closing in around me, suffocating the air. At first, it was quiet, but then, faintly, I heard a voice. "Come closer." It was soft, almost a whisper, carried by the wind. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. I glanced around but saw nothing. No figure, no movement. I laughed nervously to myself, trying to brush off the unease settling in my chest. Probably just the wind. But then I heard it again, "Come closer." This time it was clearer, more insistent, as if the voice was beckoning me. I hesitated, but curiosity won over. I walked further into the forest, the sound of my footsteps, the only thing breaking the silence. As I moved deeper, the trees seemed to close in even tighter, their branches nearly touching. The whisper grew louder. "I can see you. You can see me." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. That was not the wind. It was a voice, a person's voice, but there was no one around. I turned around, half expecting to see my friends laughing at me, but the forest was empty. Only the sound of the breeze rustling through the leaves filled the air. My legs felt heavy, like they were rooted to the ground. The voice was now all around me, echoing through the trees. It was as if the forest itself was alive, speaking to me. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have come here." Panic set in. I turned to leave, but as I moved, the trees seemed to shift, their twisted branches blocking my way. The path I had followed was no longer there, replaced by a labyrinth of thick underbrush. My heart pounded in my chest. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction felt wrong. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, and I couldn't find my way out. "Stay. Stay with me." The voice was right behind me now. I spun around, but again there was no one. Just the darkness of the trees, the oppressive silence. I was completely alone, trapped in a forest that felt more like a maze than a natural place. I ran. I didn't care which direction, just away from the voice. The sound of footsteps followed me, just out of sync with my own, like something was walking beside me. My breath quickened, panic surging through my veins. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees now closing in tight, blocking the light from above. Then I saw something. Faint at first, a shadow in the distance. But as I approached, it took shape. A figure, standing still under a thick, gnarled tree. I couldn't make out the details at first, but as I got closer, my heart stopped. It was a woman. Her hair was long and black, hanging loosely around her shoulders. She wore a dress that looked old, tattered, as if it had been left to decay for years. Her eyes, they were hollow, empty. Dark sockets that seemed to pierce through me. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching me. The whispering voice grew louder, filling my ears, my mind. "You've seen me now. You can never leave," I screamed, backing away, but the figure didn't follow. She stayed under the tree, watching, waiting. The forest was silent again, the oppressive weight lifting for just a moment. I turned and ran, not stopping until I broke free of the trees and stumbled out onto the open field. My heart was pounding, my body shaking. The moment I stepped out of the forest, the whispers stopped. The oppressive air cleared. When I looked back, the forest was just that. A normal forest. No dark figures, no whispers, but I knew what I'd heard. I knew what I'd seen. The forest had a presence, something that wasn't human, something that didn't want me to leave. I never went near that forest again, and to this day, I'm certain that some places are meant to be left alone. I grew up in Xochimilco, a neighborhood in Mexico City known for its canals, colorful boats, and vibrant culture. It's a beautiful place during the day, but there are stories here that are older than the land itself. One particular tale always haunted me. One my grandmother would tell us when we were kids, especially at night when the wind howled outside our home. She spoke of La Llorona, a ghostly figure who roams the waters of Xochimilco, weeping for her lost children. The story was simple but terrifying. A woman, once in love, drowned her children in a fit of rage. When she realized what she had done, she threw herself into the river to join them. Now she wanders, searching for her children, crying in despair. The legend was told to warn children to stay away from the canals after dark, but I always dismissed it as an old myth. One evening, a friend and I decided to test our courage. We'd heard that La Llorona's cry could still be heard if you ventured out onto the canals at night. We rented a small boat and set out with only the moonlight to guide us, laughing nervously as the boat glided through the still waters. The canal was eerily silent, the usual sounds of the city muffled in the distance. The further we went, the more isolated we felt. It wasn't long before we began to hear something. At first, it was just a faint sound, soft, almost like wind, through the trees. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder, clearer. It wasn't wind, it was a cry, a woman's cry, full of sorrow and pain. It sent a chill down my spine. My friend and I exchanged uneasy glances, our laughter faltering. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. The sound was unmistakable now. A wail, rising and falling, as if calling out from somewhere deep within the canals. We looked around, but all we saw were the dark shadows of the water stretching into the distance. The cry echoed, growing louder, closer. I knew we should turn back. Every instinct told me to head toward the shore, but something kept us there. The wailing became more desperate, more anguished, as if it were calling to us directly. It was as if the woman was right next to us. We began to row faster, our hearts pounding in our chests, but the sound followed us, no matter how quickly we moved. It felt as though the very water around us was alive with the cry. Suddenly, our boat stopped moving. The oars no longer seemed to touch the water, as if they had frozen in place. My friend and I gripped the sides of the boat, the panic starting to set in. The wailing reached a deafening peak, filling our ears, and we felt an overwhelming sense of dread. That's when I saw her. From the mist rising off the water, a figure appeared. Tall, draped in a flowing white gown, her hair wild and matted. Her face was obscured by shadows, but the faint glow of moonlight revealed her hands. They were outstretched, reaching toward us as the wailing turned into a screech of agony. Her eyes were dark, hollow pits. My heart stopped. The woman floated. Closer, the boat now moving on its own, slowly drifting toward her. I was frozen, unable to move or speak. The cry had turned into a guttural, inhuman sound. As the figure grew nearer, I could almost feel the cold of the water creeping up the sides of the boat. My friend and I held on to each other, too terrified to do anything. Just as the woman reached the edge of the boat jerked forward, with a violent lurch. We both screamed and scrambled to paddle, not daring to look back. The wailing slowly faded as we rowed frantically toward the shore, but the feeling of cold and dread lingered with us, following us all the way back. When we finally reached the dock, the city lights of Xochimilco felt like a safe haven. We didn't speak to each other as we hurried back to our homes. Neither of us ever mentioned what had happened that night, but we both knew we'd had an encounter with something far beyond what we understood. To this day, I never go near the canals after dark. The memory of La Llorona's wail still echoes in my mind, reminding me that some legends are far more than just stories. It was late in the afternoon when I arrived in the small town in Mexico. I'd come to visit some friends, and they insisted I check out the famous hospital, a building with a dark reputation. It had been abandoned for years, but there were still stories floating around about the place, tales of strange sounds, sightings of figures in windows, and the eerie feeling that something or someone was always watching. My friends, of course, didn't take it seriously, but I was always curious about these kinds of places. So, after dinner, we made our way toward the old hospital. It sat at the edge of town, its once imposing structure now covered in ivy, windows shattered, and the door left ajar as if inviting anyone brave enough to enter. The air around the building felt unnaturally still. We pushed through the rusted gates and made our way inside. The floor was littered with broken glass, old equipment, and the remnants of what had once been a place of healing. The hallways were dim, lit only by the faint light coming through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The silence was deafening, broken only by our footsteps echoing against the cold stone walls. As we walked deeper into the building, my unease grew. My friends joked and laughed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then we reached the old operating room, a place that had supposedly been the site of many failed surgeries in the past. The room was eerily pristine compared to the rest of the hospital, with faded surgical tools still laying on the counters as though someone had just left. That's when we heard it. At first, it was soft, a distant, almost imperceptible sound, but then it grew louder, clearer, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the hallway. My friends froze. I could see their faces drain of color as the footsteps grew nearer. We all turned toward the door, but no one entered. The footsteps stopped, just outside the room. We waited, silent and still, but no one came. There was no knock, no voice, nothing. Just the heavy, oppressive silence that followed. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly. I felt a chill run down my spine and my breath came out in visible puffs. A sense of dread filled the space and my heart began to race. I glanced nervously at the doorway, but there was nothing there. Then we all heard it. A soft, low whisper that seemed to echo in our ears. "Ayúdame. Help me?" It was a voice, weak and pleading, from the hallway outside. I wanted to run. I had never been more scared in my life, but my feet felt frozen to the ground. My friends and I looked at each other, eyes wide in disbelief. We didn't need to speak. It was clear that none of us wanted to be there any longer. Slowly, we backed away from the operating room and made our way toward the exit. The footsteps had stopped, but the whisper continued, following us like a shadow. As we stepped outside into the cool night air, we all felt the weight lift off our shoulders. The sense of dread that had gripped us inside the hospital seemed to dissolve the moment we left. None of us spoke immediately. We all just walked silently toward the car, trying to shake off what had happened. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The whispering voice kept echoing in my mind. "Ayúdame." It wasn't just a figment of my imagination. I knew what I had heard. The story of the Hospital de San Juan de Dios was filled with tales of botched surgeries and patients who had died in pain. But I never thought the place would still carry the weight of those spirits. It's been years since that night, but I haven't been back to Mazatlan. Every time I think of the old hospital, I remember the voice in the hallway, the footsteps that weren't supposed to be there, and the heavy feeling that something still lingers within those crumbling walls. When I was younger, my uncle invited me to visit his old hacienda deep in the countryside. It had been in the family for generations, a massive colonial-style home surrounded by fields and thick trees. He had always told us stories about strange occurrences there, but I never paid much attention. That changed the night I stayed over. The hacienda was beautiful, but eerie. The hallways were long and dimly lit, the wooden floors creaking under every step. My uncle warned me not to wander around at night. He didn't explain why, just gave me a look that sent a chill down my spine. That night, I slept in one of the old guest rooms. The air was thick with the scent of wood and dust. As I lay in bed, listening to the wind rustling outside, I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. At first, I thought it was my uncle or one of the workers, but the steps were too slow, too deliberate. They stopped right outside my door. I held my breath. A long, drawn-out creak echoed as the door handle twisted. The door didn't open, but I could hear breathing, low, ragged breaths, like someone struggling to inhale. I wanted to call out, but fear clamped my throat shut. Then, a shadow moved under the door. It stretched unnaturally, too tall, too thin. It stood there for what felt like forever, before the footsteps slowly faded away down the hall. The next morning, I told my uncle. His face went pale, and he sighed as if he had been expecting it. "You heard him," he said. I asked who. "The one who never left." He told me that decades ago, a worker on the hacienda had died under mysterious circumstances. Since then, guests had reported hearing footsteps at night, feeling watched, and even seeing a tall, dark figure in the hallways. Some claimed it was the worker's spirit, trapped in the house. Others whispered that something else had taken his place. I left that afternoon and never returned. But to this day, I still remember the shadow stretching under the door, and the breathing, as if something was waiting for me to open it. It was the summer of 1998 when I first heard the story of La Llorona, or the Weeping Woman, in the small town of Tepoztlan, Mexico. I was just a teenager at the time, visiting my cousins for the holidays. The town, nestled between steep mountains, was a place where the air felt different, thick with mystery. The people there were kind but quiet, especially when the subject of the old legends came up. One evening, after a long day of exploring the area, I sat with my cousins on the porch of their old house. The house was near a river that ran through the town. It was a cool night, and the sky was clear. We were drinking juice and talking when my cousin Marco, the oldest, began telling a story that sent chills down my spine. He spoke softly, his eyes scanning the dark as if he was ensuring no one would overhear him. "Have you heard the story of La Llorona?" I nodded, though I hadn't heard much about her. He continued, his voice low and serious. "La Llorona is a woman who wanders the riverbanks at night, crying for her children. People say she drowned her children out of jealousy or madness. Some say it was out of despair after her husband left her for another woman. But no matter what the reason, she's cursed to walk the earth for eternity, searching for her lost children. She wails, 'Ay, mis hijos.' Oh, my children. And if you hear her voice, it's already too late." I felt a cold breeze stir the air, and Marco's face grew grim. "It's not just a story," he added, lowering his voice. "I've heard her before." My heart raced. "You mean, you've actually heard La Llorona?" He nodded, his expression serious. "One night, about a year ago, I was walking near the river just outside of town. It was late, and I was coming home after meeting some friends. The moon was bright, but the area around the river was pitch black. I heard something at first, just a faint sound, like someone crying far away. I thought it was a cat or an animal in the distance. But as I walked closer, I heard it clearer. A woman crying out in anguish. 'Ay, mis hijos.' It was faint but unmistakable." Marco paused, clearly lost in the memory. I kept walking, thinking it was just a trick of the wind. But then, I saw her. A figure standing by the riverbank. She was in white, with long, disheveled hair, her back turned to me. Her voice came again, louder this time. "Ay, mis hijos." I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It felt like the air was thick, pressing down on me. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. It was like something was holding me in place. The woman turned slowly, but there was no face, just a dark void. And her eyes, empty, hollow. I shivered. Marco's voice had dropped to a whisper, his eyes wide. Then, she reached out to me as if to grab me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. When I turned around, she was gone. But I could still hear her crying, even after I got back to the house. I could hardly breathe. I'd always thought La Llorona was just a story to frighten children, but hearing Marco's words, I couldn't deny the fear in his eyes. Later that night, I was unable to sleep. My room was facing the river, and every creak of the house, every gust of wind seemed to carry her voice, whispering in the distance. "Ay, mis hijos." The sound seemed to come closer with each passing minute, I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or an animal. But no, it was unmistakable. It was her. At about 3 a.m., the wailing was so loud it was almost deafening. I could hear it clearly, just outside my window. "Ay, mis hijos," she cried over and over. My heart was pounding and I found myself paralyzed in fear. The sound was so real, so close that I thought I might scream. I must have drifted off to sleep in fear, but the next morning, when I asked Marco about it, he said it wasn't unusual for people in the town to hear La Llorona, especially near the river. "You'll hear her sometimes, especially when there's a full moon," he explained. "It's just a reminder, she's still out there. Even after all these years, I can still remember the sound of her wailing, her mournful cry echoing through the night." I never walked near the river again after that night, and I've never doubted the stories of La Llorona ever since. I was traveling through the countryside when I stumbled upon an old, abandoned train station. The place was isolated, far from any major towns. My car had broken down just outside, and after a failed attempt at getting it started again, I decided to walk around and explore while waiting for help. The train station was massive, with high stone arches and tall, cracked windows. The tracks were rusted and overgrown with weeds, and the platform was littered with debris. The air was heavy, with an unsettling stillness. It was as if time had frozen in place and the station had been left to decay in silence. At first, I thought nothing of it. I figured it had been closed for years, a relic of the past. But as I walked deeper into the station, I started to feel like something wasn't quite right. The building seemed to press in on me, its towering walls casting long, oppressive shadows. The silence became more intense, suffocating. I found myself wandering into what seemed to be the old waiting area. It was dark, with only a few rays of light piercing through the grime-covered windows. The walls were lined with old, cracked benches, some of which had been overturned. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and the air smelled musty, like old books left forgotten. But then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it quickly grew louder. My heart started to pound. The sound was coming from the far corner of the waiting room, near a small door that led deeper into the station. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was walking toward me. I froze, listening intently. The tapping stopped. For a long moment there was only silence. Then I heard the distinct sound of a train whistle in the distance, far off but unmistakable. It was odd, because there hadn't been a train in service for years. The tracks were old, overrun with weeds, and nothing had passed through this station for as long as anyone could remember. I nervously moved closer to the door, my curiosity getting the best of me. The tapping had stopped again, but the whistle was still echoing through the station. I reached for the door handle and slowly pushed it open. The air inside was colder, almost unbearably so. The room was dark, the faint outline of old furniture visible in the dim light. As I stepped inside, the temperature dropped even further, and I felt a rush of cold air sweep through the room, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I barely had time to process what was happening when the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, panic rising in my chest, but when I tried to open the door again, it wouldn't budge. It was as if it had locked itself. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, sitting in a decrepit chair, was a figure. It was draped, in shadow, too dark to make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt frozen in place, unable to move. Then, without warning, the figure stood. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and moved with a jerky, disjointed motion, like something that hadn't moved in years. The train whistle sounded again, but this time it was much closer, almost as if the train were right outside the station, preparing to pull in. I backed away, heart pounding, desperate to get out of the room. But as I turned toward the door, it was no longer there. Instead, the waiting room from before appeared again, but it was different. The benches were all occupied by shadowy figures, their faces hidden in darkness. They sat perfectly still, like passengers waiting for a train that would never come. The train whistle blew one final time, louder now, deafening. And, as it did, I felt the cold figure's hand brush against my shoulder. I don't remember how I got out of the station. All I know is that I ran, and I didn't stop until I was far away from that place. The car was somehow running when I got back to it, and I drove off without a second thought, not looking back. I haven't been back to that station, but sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I can hear the faint sound of a train whistle in the distance, and I wonder if the passengers are still waiting. It was late in the afternoon when I arrived in a small town, invited by friends to visit. They suggested I explore the local hospita, an abandoned building with a dark reputation. It had been closed for years, but the locals still whispered about strange happenings, noises, sightings of figures in windows, and an eerie feeling that someone was always watching. Though I hadn't believed in such things before, my curiosity got the better of me. After dinner, we made our way toward the old hospital. The building sat on the edge of town, its once impressive structure now crumbling, overtaken by ivy, with broken windows and a door left ajar as if inviting anyone brave enough to enter. The air around the place felt unnaturally still, and we hesitated as we pushed open the rusted gates. Inside, the floor was littered with debris, broken glass, old medical equipment, and the remnants of what had once been a place of healing. The hallways were dim, lit only by faint light filtering through the boarded-up windows. The silence inside was thick, and our footsteps echoed in the cold, hollow space. As we walked deeper into the building, unease crept over me. My friends were laughing and joking, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong. Eventually, we reached the old operating room, a place rumored to be the site of many failed surgeries. To our surprise, it seemed far cleaner than the rest of the hospital, with faded surgical tools still lying on the counters, as though someone had just left. That's when we heard it. At first it was faint, almost imperceptible. Then the sound grew louder, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching from the hallway. My friends froze, their faces draining of color. The footsteps grew nearer, and we all turned toward the door, but no one appeared. The footsteps stopped just outside the room. We stood in silence, waiting. No knock, no voice. Just the eerie stillness pressing in on us. Then, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. I could feel the chill creep down my spine, and my breath became visible in the sudden cold. A sense of dread washed over me. Glancing nervously at the doorway, there was nothing there, and then we all heard it. A soft, low whisper as if someone was right behind us. "Ayúdame." Help me. The voice was faint, almost like a breath, but it was unmistakable. I wanted to run. Fear gripped me like a vice, but my feet wouldn't move. My friends and I exchanged wide-eyed glances, but no one dared to speak. We didn't need to. We all felt it. Something was wrong, and we needed to leave. Slowly, we backed away from the operating room and began to make our way toward the exit. The footsteps had stopped, but the whisper continued, trailing us like a shadow. Once outside in the cool night air, the weight seemed to lift, but we were all shaken. No one spoke as we walked silently back to the car. The only sound was the crunch of gravel underfoot. We were all trying to shake off the feeling of something lingering behind us, inside the crumbling walls of that old hospital. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. The voice, "Ayúdame," echoed in my mind. It wasn't my imagination. I knew what I had heard. The hospital had been filled with stories. Patients who had died in agony, surgeries that went horribly wrong, but I had never thought the spirits would still be tied to the place. Since then, I've never returned to that town. Each time I think of the old hospital, I remember the whisper, the footsteps that didn't belong, and the deep, overwhelming sense that something still waits in the dark corners of that decaying building. In a small town in Mexico, nestled deep in the mountains, there's a place called El Rio de la Llorona, the River of the Weeping Woman. This story, told through generations, is one that has haunted my family for years. It was a quiet summer evening when I decided to visit the river with a few of my cousins. We were in our late teens, fearless and full of youthful bravado. My uncle, who grew up in the town, always warned us to stay away from the river after sunset. "There's something there," he'd say. "Something you don't want to meet." But we laughed it off, thinking it was just an old man's tale. The river was located at the edge of the town, winding through thick woods that grew darker as the sun dipped behind the hills. It was a beautiful spot, crystal clear water that sparkled under the late afternoon sun and trees that stretched high above us. But something in the air that day felt different. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, leaving behind an eerie silence. My cousins and I sat by the riverbank, dipping our feet in the cool water. As the night approached, the temperature dropped quickly and the air grew heavier. We talked and joked, but some presence, made the back of my neck prickle. I noticed the water had become unnaturally still, reflecting the darkening sky like a mirror. That's when we heard it. A faint wailing sound carried through. The air, soft at first but growing louder. It wasn't a cry of a person. It was a low, mournful sound, like the wind howling through the trees. We all froze, staring at each other in confusion. "It's just the wind," my cousin Diego said, but his voice shook slightly. The wail continued, and then we heard something else. A faint splashing, like someone wading through the water. I stood up, my heart racing, and walked toward the edge of the river, peering into the dark water. That's when I saw her. A woman, floating in the water, her long black hair trailing behind her like a veil. She was dressed in a white, tattered gown, and her pale, lifeless face seemed to glow under the moonlight. Her eyes were wide, empty, and staring right at me. We all backed away, panic rising in our throats. The sound of her crying filled the air, and it felt as though the entire forest was holding its breath. I could feel the cold from the river creep into my bones, and I knew, without a doubt, that we weren't alone. Then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. The water splashed once, violently, as though she had vanished into it in a single movement. The air seemed to return to normal, but the wailing continued, now coming from the trees behind us. We didn't need to say a word. Without looking back, we ran through the woods, hearts pounding, until we reached the safety of the town. When we told the older people in the village what had happened, they weren't surprised. "You saw La Llorona," my aunt said quietly, as if it was something everyone knew. "La Llorona," she explained, "is the spirit of a woman who drowned her children in the river out of grief and madness, and now she wanders the waters, crying for them. She's known to appear when people are near the river, especially at night. From that day on, I never went near the river again, and neither did my cousins. The wailing, though, never left my mind. Every night I'd hear faint cries like distant echoes, and sometimes I could almost see her, her pale face in the water, her mournful wail just on the edge of hearing." Years later, I returned to that small town, now with children of my own. I went to the river, but it was quiet. There was no wail, no woman in the water. The town had changed, and so had I. But as I sat by the riverbank, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, waiting, watching from the depths. And the wail, soft but distinct, still echoed in my mind. A few years ago, I ended up staying at an old guest house on the outskirts of a small town. My plan was simple: escape the city for a weekend and enjoy some quiet time. The guest house was charming, rustic, and peaceful, located next to an abandoned theater that no one had bothered to renovate or tear down. The place had always fascinated me. From the outside, it looked like something out of a different time, tall, imposing, and full of decaying grandeur. My curiosity got the best of me, and one evening after a long day of hiking, I decided to explore the theater. I had heard from the locals that the theater had once been the heart of the town, a place for plays, performances, and celebrations. But that was decades ago. Rumor had it that a tragic fire had destroyed much of it, and after the incident, the theater had been left to rot. Yet there was still something hauntingly beautiful about it. The front doors of the theater were warped and creaked as I pushed them open. A gust of cold air hit my face, and the smell of dust and mold immediately overwhelmed me. The grand lobby was dark, and the only light came from my phone's flashlight. It felt like stepping into a forgotten world, where time had stopped. Ventured further into the lobby and noticed the old ticket counter, the wood splintered and worn with age. But it was the grand staircase that caught my attention. It curved up into the darkened upper levels, the shadows casting strange patterns along the walls. As I started to climb, I heard something. Soft footsteps echoing from the balcony above. I froze, thinking someone else had entered. But when I reached the top, there was no one there. I explored the balcony, which overlooked the main stage. The seats were in shambles, the fabric torn and faded, and the floor was covered in debris. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My breath came out in shallow gasps, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That's when I saw it. On the stage below, there was a faint figure. It was only for a split second, just a flash of white. A person, or what looked like one, standing motionless in the center of the stage, their arms by their sides. The figure seemed too still, too unnatural. I stepped back, heart pounding, and reached for my phone to illuminate the stage. When I shone the light directly at the spot where the figure had been, there was nothing there. My first thought was that I had imagined it, just the trick of shadows and my exhaustion. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again, a soft whisper coming from the direction of the stage. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a voice. Low, almost as if someone was calling my name. I knew I shouldn't have stayed any longer, but curiosity had a hold of me. I turned back and moved cautiously toward the stage. As I stepped down the stairs, the whispering grew louder, like it was following me. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I turned on my flashlight again, scanning the stage. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw it. A seat, one lone chair that hadn't been damaged. It was placed in the center of the stage, facing forward. I walked over, almost hypnotically. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. I stood beside the chair, staring at it, and that's when I felt it. A cold hand brushed my shoulder. I turned quickly, but there was nothing behind me. The temperature had dropped drastically. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I could see my breath clouding in the light of my phone. That's when the voice came again, but this time it was clear. Leave. I didn't wait for a second invitation. My legs moved of their own accord, and I bolted for the door. I didn't look back, not once. The whispering faded as I ran, but I could still feel the weight of that gaze on my back. I never went back to the theater. The next morning, I heard from the guest house owner that there had been talk of the theater being haunted for years. They said some of the performers who had died in the fire were still trapped there, reliving their last moments. Maybe it's all superstition, but every time I pass by a forgotten abandoned building, I can't shake the feeling that some places, some things aren't meant to be explored.